Greetings. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center, what we call WISC. And WISC has been exploring the geopolitics of the energy transition. And we're not debating whether to decarbonize. The debate is how to do that in the most efficient, most effective way, and what are the geopolitical implications of that. As we're exploring that today, we're very thrilled to have Karthik Ramanna, a professor of business and public policy at the University of Oxford Blavatnik School of Government. He's also the author of The Age of Outrage, How to Lead in a Polarized World. And central to our discussion here today, he's also a co-founder of the E-Liability Institute, which is a global nonprofit advancing the urgent accounting upgrade needed to drive green innovation. So, Professor Ramanna, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to talk about your ideas, and let's start by exploring. You outlined that there's really two sides of how we approach decarbonization. What is the fault line? How do you see it?
Yeah. So I like the way you frame this, which is that we're not talking about the need for decarbonization. I think that there's great clarity on because if you follow the scientific evidence, 1 in every 3 molecules of CO2 in the atmosphere today have been put there since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And half of that amount, 1 in every 6, has been put there just since the 1980s. So there's an urgent need to decarbonize. Now, when we started on this project about 3 years ago, I was a relative newcomer to this space, and I was struck by the way we were going about measuring the emissions of entities, of products into the atmosphere. It seemed inconsistent with the way you would do basic accounting in the financial space. And as I dug deeper, I came to realize that the accounting systems we use in the emission space today are not really designed to measure performance of entities or products, but they're designed with a broader sort of almost ideological bent to them. They're designed with a bent associated with, in some sense, reducing consumerism in society, or designed with a bent to ending the use of fossil fuels in the economy. Now, these are valid public objectives that in a democratic society people might wish to hold and advance, but they are somewhat unrelated to the fundamental issue of addressing decarbonization. If the challenge is addressing decarbonization, then we need a fairly natural and physical approach to it rather than a political or ideological approach to it. And that's been the core of the fault line that we've encountered as we've tried to bring this more technocratic accounting solution to this challenge.
Now, you've outlined 4 building blocks that you need to achieve in order to have a balancing between these fault lines. One of them dealing with the complexity of the problem, and the other being innovation. Tell us about those first 2 building blocks.
Yeah. The first and most important thing to recognize about climate change, or the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, is that it is the result of billions of decisions, perhaps trillions of decisions, by individuals who, make decisions associated with consumption. I could have chosen to take a car here, or I could have chosen to take the metro, or I could have chosen to walk. That's a decision that will impact the amount of emissions put out into the atmosphere. Likewise, I could decide to eat a ribeye on my birthday, or I could decide not to. I could decide to go vegetarian. That's a decision that affects climate change. So climate change and the presence of CO2 and other harmful greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is the result of billions of decisions that people freely make in a market society, in a free society. So if we come to recognize that the problem of climate change is the result of these sort of decentralized, freely pursued decisions by individual consumers, which then feed through supply chains to businesses that supply those consumers and to the businesses that supply those businesses, then we would take a bottoms-up approach to addressing this problem rather than a top-down approach to saying, we should tax all fossil fuels, or we should end the use of all fossil fuels. Because if we ended the use of fossil fuels today, it would be tremendously inflationary, and of course it would effectively shut down the economy. So that's not a viable solution if we're serious about decarbonization. We have to look at solutions that operate from the bottom up. So that's the first insight, that addressing climate change, addressing the challenge of decarbonization requires acknowledging that this is a systemic problem that is requires sort of an action at the decentralized level. The second insight is, well, if you're trying to solve this systemic problem that requires, billions of consumers making different decisions, then you need to innovate. You need to try many different things because there isn't one silver bullet solution that's going to radically shift the way consumers change their behavior. Of course, different things drive different consumers in the context of different decisions they make. So you're going to require a host of innovations, and you're going to have to incentivize companies that supply consumers with the goods and services they desire. You're going to have to incentivize them to actually supply those things that consumers want in the pursuit of decarbonization. So that requires radical new forms of innovation. So some of that innovation might be, for instance, using hybrid vehicles instead of electric vehicles, or it might involve using solar power instead of fossil fuel-based power. But some of those innovations might involve the kinds of things that we haven't even imagined, right? So rather than the government or some sort of a small set of experts determining what are the 3 ideal technologies that the whole world should embrace in the pursuit of addressing climate change, we need to create a market-based incentive system that allows businesses to compete on decarbonization technology. So it's those 2 core ideas, those 2 core insights, that this is a problem that is the result of billions of consumption choices, and that it therefore addressing this problem requires us to basically encourage innovation in billions of different ways. That's the way in which you want to start to think about decarbonization.
Great explanation. Now, your third building block is the idea that we ought to be looking at this from a systematic perspective, a total system, as opposed to an individual net zero goal. Explain that.
Yeah. So I think perhaps largely for the reasons that they want to raise the salience of the climate change issue, much of the existing climate change establishment has hooked on to this idea of net zero and the idea that all products need to be net zero, or all companies or entities need to be net zero, countries need to be net zero. But if you think about it, that is actually tremendously costly. It would result in effectively shutting down large parts of the economy. It would result in mass joblessness. It would probably result in a tremendous amount of violence in society. And I mean, it's physically impossible to decarbonize certain value chains. So the idea that every entity should be net zero is largely performative. It's largely sort of a rhetorical device, and it might be useful in some limited measure of raising the salience of the climate problem. But it's not a realistic solution because there is no state in the world in which every entity will be net zero. The only kind of net zero that matters, my colleague Miles Allen at the University of Oxford was the first to point this out, the only kind of net zero that matters is geological net zero. Geological net zero means that we are effectively not putting out any net increase in CO2 or other harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So for every mole of CO2 that we release into the atmosphere, we have indefinitely sequestered a mole of CO2 through some sort of carbon capture and storage technology. That's the only kind of net zero that matters. It's at the geological scale. Now, once you recognize that that's the net zero that matters, then you say, well, there will be some entities in the economy that will be net positive. There will be some entities in the economy that will be net negative. And in fact, we should allow for a decentralized process, a market-based process, to figure out which entities will be which by creating some sort of performance measurement system to get us to that goal, that sort of collective goal of geological net zero. So that's the third and important insight here, that it is profoundly costly and somewhat unrealistic and in fact counterproductive to imagine or expect every entity to be net zero. It can't be. It's only the planet that needs to be net zero.
So as we're trying to get the planet to net zero, your fourth building block is that we need to have some kind of way of measuring a performance metric of carbon, and as you suggest, beyond carbon later on, there's other things we need to worry about as well. But the accounting method is important, which you call an e-liability method. Explain that process.
That's right. So the accounting system then becomes critical because what you're trying to do is say that we want to get to this global goal of geological net zero, but we want individual decisions of consumers, of the entities that supply those consumers, and the entities that supply those entities to all drive us through some collective process toward that net zero, right? That geological net zero. That requires a global performance measurement system on the moles of CO2 or the moles of greenhouse gases that you put out into the atmosphere as a result of various industrial activities. That's the kind of accounting system that you need. It's not a value-laden accounting system. In fact, it's deeply physical accounting system or a deeply chemical accounting system because it's an accounting system that actually simply just counts the moles of CO2 from various activities. That's the kind of accounting system you want operating throughout the economy, throughout the global economy, so that consumers can then make purchasing decisions on the basis of this information. Just like you have nutrition information on cereal boxes. And by putting nutrition information on cereal boxes, we change consumer patterns. People started eating healthier foods. They stopped eating high sugar cereals. They started eating cereals that had more nutritional content. In the same way, you give consumers the choice. And of course, that consumption pressure will drive up the economy to investors who will actually therefore fuel these sort of low emissions technologies through investment opportunities. It will fuel sort of an incentive through supply chains for companies to innovate in this space. And this is where the performance measurement system, the e-liability system as we're calling it, that e-liability system simply tracks that progress. Now, if this sounds somewhat esoteric and this sounds somewhat unimaginable, the historical analogy that I give people is the invention or the creation of generally accepted accounting principles, what is otherwise called GAAP. So prior to 1935, the term GAAP didn't exist. If you think about what happened before 1935, companies basically invented the definition of assets or liabilities or revenues for themselves. And by the way, they didn't even have to tell you what those definitions were. And that, of course, seems like a terrible idea, and it was. It resulted in the crash of 1929. There was tremendous chicanery and confusion as a result. And so one of the things that we did in the 1930s was this idea that maybe it's good common sense to have one set of accounting rules that operate for the economy. So in fact, it was the US government that first led on this initiative. It was a small group of just 17 people from business, government, and academia that came together between 1935 and 1940. And they created the first iteration of GAAP. And today, of course, GAAP is sort of this global public good. It exported itself from the US to other parts of the world. Outside the US, it might be called something like IFRS, or it'll have different names, but it's the same core principles. And that global public good has allowed us to build a market economy on which trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth have been created. So in the same way, if you create a common accounting system that measures the moles of CO2 or CH4 or other greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere as a result of various activities, and you deploy that system across the economy, then you have a bottom-up way of addressing this problem. And we've been now piloting this approach in a number of different entities. We've done this in some large Fortune 500 companies in cement, steel, automotive, oil and gas sectors. We're also running some pilots now in the agriculture sector. We've run some pilots in the healthcare sector. So we're looking at services as well. And the good news is that it's relatively easy to do this because it runs on the same logic as the financial accounting system. And we've trained millions of financial accountants that are already out there in the economy. And for them, this is just one added thing that they need to do as part of sort of their regular operation. So you're not trying to reinvent the wheel or create some massive new compliance process or anything like that. It's something that can run on the existing financial accounting infrastructure that's already out there. And but advances in things like distributed ledgers, actually the cost of deploying this kind of system through the economy will be quite small, is what we're finding through our pilot studies. So if we put our mind to it, if we put our will to it, just like we did in 1935, and we created GAAP, we can create a global e-liability system that addresses this problem, that unleashes the economic forces, the market forces, to correct this problem.
So when you really think about what the general accepted accounting principles has done, it's really been fundamental, foundational for the market economy that has given us so much prosperity around the world. And you're seeing the same thing with an accounting system for carbon that can unleash that. Explain how you see that unfolding. We get this accounting system in place. What types of other sort of prods do we need to have the kind of decarbonization that the world is looking for?
Yeah. So there are sort of inherent market forces that will sort of leash onto these accounting systems and effectively create the incentive for decarbonized innovations through supply chain. So we've tried this, for instance, in the context of the manufacture of electrical transformers. Hitachi Energy was one of the pilot companies in our studies. And Hitachi Energy makes electrical transformers, and copper is a key component in electrical transformers. And copper is a very dirty material to mine. So one of the things we did was by measuring the emissions associated with copper mining in various supply chains that supply to Hitachi transformers, as well as measuring the emissions associated with recycling copper, we were able to put some numbers on this. And by the way, one of the key insights of that study was that it's not always recycling copper that's lower emissions than mining copper from sort of, from the earth. Because some virgin mines of copper are so efficient relative to those recycling operations that you're actually better off doing virgin mining than you are doing recycling. So from a public policy perspective, the idea that you would build a green policy and say all recycling is good and all mining is bad, that's actually not the case once you start counting the physical moles of CO2 that go into the atmosphere. And so the answer with this is going to be it's a continuous variable that is introduced into supply chains. And as we saw in that Hitachi example, once you started putting this information in the supply chains, then purchasing managers and operational managers started making different decisions. For instance, they went to their recycling supplier and they said, if you want us to buy your recycled copper, that's the emissions number you've got to beat, the emissions number from the low emissions mine, right? So now the recycling provider has to change their processes. So for instance, they're not incinerating the plastic that coats the old copper wires because that releases even more emissions, right? So by counting these things, you're creating incentives in supply chain for people to actually solve the problem that needs to be solved. One of the tremendous pull factors at a systemic level to put this system in place is quite sort of ironically, economic nationalism. We're seeing sort of, across the globe, sort of a pushback against globalization and a rise of economic nationalism. And here in the United States, in some sense, regardless of who wins in November, we're going to see economic nationalism on the political agenda. And part of that economic nationalism is driven by a desire to level up international manufacturing to the high standards of U.S. manufacturing. For instance, if U.S. steel is less emissions intensive than, say, steel from China, then what a carbon border assessment does is create an incentive for China to improve its emissions performance and for companies that are making that trade-off to also look at the emissions performance of U.S. manufacturers as they sort of make purchasing decisions. So that kind of carbon border assessment that is increasingly being deployed across major economies around the world, we're probably going to see more and more of that in the course of the next 5 years, that's creating a strong desire and demand for this kind of carbon accounting. Because of course you can't have that carbon border assessment if you don't have a taxable basis, if you don't have an assessment basis. And that assessment basis is something that will come from this e-liability system. So that's one of the pull factors.
Well, this is a interesting idea that the world needs to really better reflect on as to how powerful it can be to have a measurement. And as you mentioned your Hitachi example, the result may be different. I mean, are we pushing certain agendas or are we pushing decarbonization? If we're pushing decarbonization, let's look at what really does that. I reflect back on a role in a prior life that we needed to measure, the French government required measurement of carbon intensity for all products on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And we found that a lamb chop raised outside of Paris had more carbon in it than a lamb chop raised in New Zealand and shipped across the ocean, mm-hmm. because whatever amount of carbon resulted from the shipping, that being grass-fed in New Zealand versus corn-fed in France, yep, made the difference in carbon. So it'll force us to really think about the issues and whether it's consumers driving that or, as you described, the other forces that can come into play. This is something that I think we need to seriously consider. So thank you for your insights here today. Very much appreciated. Again, this is the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition at the Wilson Center. We're very pleased to have Professor Karthik Ramanna from Oxford Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned to WISC for future insights.